I'm Michael Savage. Share this podcast with 5 people. Do the world a favor. Hi, Colonel.
Hey, good to see you, Doctor.
Oh, my God. Things are really heating up. It looks to me like it's Vietnam 2.0.
Well, the Ukrainians have already lost almost 3 times the number of dead than we did in Vietnam in the last 9 months. And stop and consider that for a minute. 157,000 dead.
How do we confirm these numbers? Who are we getting it from?
Well, you're not going to get it from the Ukrainians. So you have to look at other sources. In fact, the Russians have published some, but most of what I know comes from people who are intelligence types working on contract, as well as people on the ground over there that I know. Remember, I grew up with Ukrainians and Poles in North Philadelphia. And I lived in Europe for 10 years, so I have a few friends. And,
so you're a very reliable source. I mean, I love having you on this podcast. I get friends who I really admire, who I've known for years, and some of them special forces, who I wouldn't expect to like you because they're probably deeply enmeshed in the military right now. Some of these guys are probably over there fighting. My guess is we have special forces, like in Vietnam, as advisors. Would you say that's probably highly likely?
Yes, more so now than ever, because the Ukrainians are running out of able-bodied men who are willing to fight.
Well, this just came out. Ukraine helicopter crash kills Interior Minister and others. It crashed into a kindergarten in a Fargi suburb of Kiev, killing him and about a dozen other people, including a child on the ground. Do you think, how would we know? Is that an accident?
They were flying in extremely bad weather, very low visibility. Mm-hmm. It's a Puma helicopter, which is a French manufacturer. It's a very fine aircraft. And what I'm being told is that they may well have hit a high-tension wire.
So you would agree it's an accident?
Yes.
Not related to the war. It's just bad flying, bad weather.
Bad weather. And I'll bet that the pilot probably told his passengers we shouldn't fly. And they said it's vital that we do it.
I would agree.
The pilot probably went along with it. That's what happened when most of the Polish leadership 20 years ago was killed flying to a memorial at the Katyn Forest.
Oh,
they had the president, the prime minister, everybody was on board. And the pilot said, we should not land in Belarus because it's too dangerous. I don't have good visibility. And the president kept haranguing him. Finally, he agreed and they crashed and everybody was killed.
Here's another one from Clayton Morrison. I know you've been on his YouTube piece. Russia just issued a warning, Colonel, of a major false flag operation that is set to hit Ukraine's grain infrastructure. Ukraine is now walking back claims about the destruction of an apartment complex that killed dozens of civilians. Any word on that, Colonel?
Well, as far as the apartment complex is concerned, it looks as though an anti-aircraft missile fired by the Ukrainians struck an incoming Russian missile, and the debris from the strike fell on the apartment building. In other words, it was by no means a deliberate attack on civilian infrastructure. All this business about Russians are attacking civilian infrastructure and killing civilians has always been a lot of nonsense. It's just not true.
Well, here's the question that I have to keep raising. I would agree with you by what I have seen as a civilian is that Russia's tiptoeing around the Ukrainian civilian population. And as a result, that's why they're not making any real headway in their war from their point of view, in one regard. It seems to me it's the same war plan of one hand behind the back that we used in Vietnam. And yet there are those behind Putin who want him to go full force with a major invasion and get it over with. What's the truth here?
Well, first of all, I think we were much more indiscriminate in Vietnam than you realize. So, in fact, I would argue that we and the British were extremely indiscriminate during World War II, and that tradition carried on through all the subsequent wars that we fought. On the other hand, I don't think Putin has to destroy large numbers of civilian lives or civilian infrastructure in order to win. And I think he knows that. Look, we've got over, 10, 11 million displaced in Ukraine.
Right.
There were maybe 35 million people in the country. They used to say, well, there were 40 million Ukrainians, but certainly in the first 10, 15 years of this century, at least 9 or 10 million Ukrainians simply left because they couldn't find work and they couldn't work through the corruption in the country. So there were never as many Ukrainians in Ukraine to begin with as originally expected. So when you look at that, that means you're back to what, 25 million Ukrainians left inside the country, and more are still trying to leave. So I think Putin knows he doesn't have to kill them to be successful. Now, the bad news is the Ukrainians have done exactly what we've seen the Palestinians and others in the Middle East do to the Israelis. They do set up gun positions and missile launchers in civilian areas. When that happens, you have no choice. You have to go after it, and you hope for the best as far as collateral damage is concerned. But I always push back against this because I've spent a lot of time with the Israelis, and I do know something about the Russians because I did go there and I had some interaction with the military. They're not interested in killing civilians. They just aren't. It's no way to win. They understand that very clearly.
Terrible situation, because if the Russians are massing 1.5 million troops now, or whatever the number is, they have an army of 1.5 million active that they're building up. They're going to launch how many people in their winter offensive? How many troops?
Well, we accounted, this is 6 weeks ago, we accounted for 550,000 that would be part of the force that attacks Ukraine in the winter. Since then, I think they've added another 100,000, but most of the 100,000 they've added are in support roles, medical evacuation infrastructure, transportation, railheads, ammunition handlers, this kind of thing. As far as the 1.5 million, they're nowhere near that yet. And that's the sad outcome of our stupidity in this Ukrainian operation. We have literally induced the Russians to regain their former position as a major continental military power.
Unbelievable. And our military readiness level is lower than ever, correct?
It's pathetic.
What's
Look, we can't even recruit. We have, 457,000 troops in the United States Army. I mean, that's ridiculous. For a nation of our size, we should be able to maintain an army of 600,000 without batting an eye. Well, we can't because people don't want to be in it.
Vaccinations, affirmative action, the brainwashing, telling white people that they're no good. Who the hell would want to enlist into such a hellhole?
Well, it's that. Plus, you have Betty Sue, who is all of 5'2", 5'3", and weighs 110 pounds. And you're being told that Betty Sue's just as good as you are, and there's nothing you can do that she can't do better. So the average strapping young man looks at this and says, fine, you don't need me, right?
Well, China certainly has used women as cannon fodder. Why can't we?
Oh, God. Well,
yesterday's news. Top U.S. general meets Ukrainian counterpart near edge of war zone, Washington Post. First time in person, we had the great Mark Milley, chairman of the so-called Joint Chiefs of Staff, meeting General Valery Zaluzhny. And they were no longer meeting by Zoom. They were meeting in person. And I guess they're talking about all the goodies that are coming Zelensky's way, the tanks, the Patriot system. And last time you and I spoke, you clearly explained that the Patriots are a very limited system, very limited number of missiles, and they're made mainly for protecting a city infrastructure and nothing more. So what is this all about? I mean, they're sending Tiger tanks from Germany, from.
No. Let me stop you there. I just was told that Schultz, who is a disappointing figure to say the least, has now sent a message to Biden in Washington that the Germans will not send any Leopard tanks unless the United States is willing to send its own tanks. And since we are unwilling to send any tanks, this means the Germans won't send their tanks. Now, I mean, there's almost nobody I can think of on the European continent that is more disappointing than Schultz. Perhaps Macron runs him a close second. But I must say I'm glad that Schultz at least has managed to find the strength to push this ball into Biden's court. And he's making a point. Look, if we're not willing to provide them, and, we have 7,000 or 8,000 M1 series tanks. Of course, most of them aren't in very good shape. They're sitting in what we call boneyards in most cases. Then why should the Germans chip in and send their tanks?
Well, Zelensky wants Abrams tanks. He wants nothing but the best.
Of course. Well, that's because he doesn't know that the Abrams tank is a gas guzzler par excellence.
As you pointed out on this, you pointed that out on this podcast.
Yeah. No, I mean, if you're going to make a choice from the standpoint of logistics, you're much better off with the German tank.
What is the Tiger? Is it a derivation of the old Panther tanks?
No, it's a Leopard. It's a Leopard. It's well, if you look at all of the tanks that we have, if you look at the tanks that we built after the Second World War, they were all patterned on the German tanks of the Second World War, particularly the Tiger and the Panther.
Interesting.
The one breakaway model is the Merkava that the Israelis produce, because that was the first one to include a compartment in the back of the tank where you could carry infantry or medical supplies or extra ammunition. And they put the engine in the front of the vehicle, which meant that you instantaneously added tremendous protection to the crew, because in addition to the normal armor, you now had the engine in front, which would stop additional projectiles. Because the point is, in war, you want the crew to survive. You can always provide another tank. Of
course, but the engine in front makes it more vulnerable to immediate explosion, doesn't it, by being hit by it?
No, not the way it's built. They built the compartment so the compartment is insulated from any explosion up front. So the engine really adds to protection.
Interesting.
That's why the Merkava is such an excellent vehicle, and it's unfortunate that we haven't paid more attention to it. But anyway, other than that, the Leopard is just the Leopard 4, which is what they're talking about, is a very fine tank. Does everything ours can do and more, and it's not a fuel problem.
Did you have anything to do with the Israeli tank development? I'm just curious, because you're a tank man.
No, that man has just passed away. Actually, he was a very interesting man, kind of a cantankerous character, as you can imagine.
Please, an Israeli being cantankerous? You must be joking.
Yeah. No, but no, he passed away recently. But no, I didn't. But I'm just an admirer, and of course, the thing they do, which we're unwilling to do, is that they simply take out a fresh piece of paper, they sit down, and they draw something new and say, let's go try this. And they'll tinker with it and experiment with it under all sorts of conditions until they get something that works. We tend to build on whatever is already there, another version of it, or, it becomes a Rube Goldberg device. It has to have, 16 different weapon systems on it, and it has to protect against 5,000 different threats. That sort of thing never works. The Israelis don't have that problem.
They're not worried about white supremacy in the plans.
Well, the enemy, if you're an Israeli, the enemy is at your gates.
It's a little different. Well, and here but Colonel, and here the enemy's through the gates. Yes. We won't go into that one. So 1.5 million people, we talked about that. Yesterday, NATO surveillance planes deployed to Romania. What's that about?
Well, first of all, I don't know what specific planes they're talking about, if they're fighters or whatever. It looks to me right now as though we're doing a lot of things out of a sense of desperation. Let me explain.
Desperation?
When you talk to someone who's in finance, in the markets, you'll hear people routinely say, what are the fundamentals? What are the fundamentals? Before I invest in something, what are the fundamentals? Before I invest in the market, what are the fundamentals? When we decided, or the sainted leadership in Washington decided to unleash this war on Russia, which is really what happened. The Russians simply responded to try and defend themselves after they'd lost thousands of Russians in the two provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk, to Ukrainian artillery and rocket fire. And they saw this huge Ukrainian army building up in preparation for an attack. The Russians said, that's enough. We're going to put an end to this. But when we decided to go pedal to the metal, so to say, we failed to address the fundamentals. First, can you isolate your opponent? The answer is no, you can't isolate Russia. You can't isolate it from other countries. You can't isolate its markets. You can't isolate its industries. Second, can you starve it of resources? No, they have all of the resources that they need. How much can you hurt it given the position of their economy? Well, their economy is not the strongest, but their economy is not really vulnerable to much that we can do to it because it's not that closely integrated with the rest of the world. So all of those mistakes were made up front. Then the second was, well, look at these Russians. They staggered into eastern Ukraine. They didn't come in with guns blazing. They seem to have made all of these terrible mistakes, yet nobody listened to Putin when he said, we don't really want to kill large numbers of Ukrainian Orthodox Christians. We're not here to murder people. We want a negotiated settlement. So his operation was designed from the beginning to be limited and to demonstrate the seriousness with which they were treating the strategic question of Ukraine's membership in NATO and its position geopolitically vis-a-vis Russia. Well, we decided to ignore all of that. And for 90 days, Putin, frankly, I think, persisted in the delusion that he was going to find somebody to talk to end it. Finally, after 90 days, they said, well, this isn't going to work. And they went over to the defense and economy of force measure, made decisions about mobilization, committing additional forces, changing out the command structure, altering the command structure. So here we sit now at the end of this process, and the Russians are now prepared to strike a crushing blow. In the meantime, they've continued to incrementally strengthen their position in the south and conduct limited operations designed, for the most part, to entice the Ukrainians into attacking, which they've done, which has cost the Ukrainians immense numbers of soldiers. Now, right now, we're looking at 122,000 dead Ukrainians in uniform that we can pinpoint. In addition to that, the Ukrainians admit that they have 35,000 more Ukrainian soldiers missing in action. Well, those are presumed dead. So now you're talking about 157,000 dead Ukrainian troops, another 400,000 wounded because the hospitals are bursting with wounded, terrible wounds. And the Russians, meantime, have lost, we estimate, between 16 and 20,000 dead, and perhaps 20, 30, 40,000 wounded at the most. So what has happened is that Ukraine has drained itself of strength, of power, of capability, and the Russians are now peaking. They're stronger than they've ever been. Their force is stronger than it's been in 30 years, and is going to get much stronger after this war. And as a result, I think everyone in Washington is saying, we've got to ship everything we can before it's too late. The problem is, it is too late. Ukraine has no chance whatsoever of winning this.
Not only that,
and the intelligent thing is to stop it.
Of course, and here's a part that troubles me deeply. At Davos, Kissinger, who was the lone holdout amongst the old guard intelligentsia, so to speak, who called for a settlement 4 months ago and was roundly called every name under the sun, gravely disappointed me. But of course, I don't know him, but I know why he did it. He announced from Davos that there's no reason Ukraine should not join NATO.
Now that this process has reached this level, the idea of a neutral Ukraine under these conditions is no longer meaningful. And at the end of the process that I described, it ought to be guaranteed by NATO in whatever forms NATO can develop. But I believe Ukrainian membership in NATO would be an appropriate outcome.
When I saw that, I said, that's so clear what happened. He was told, you want to stay in the club, Hank? You want to stay in the club, Hank? Well, here's the party line. The party line is Ukraine joins NATO. So then he couched it by saying, however, they still should seek a settlement. There should be peace. So he wanted it both ways. Typical fork-tongued Henry Kissinger. The old Kissinger came back. I'm sure you would agree with me. There's almost nothing that can be. I mean, that's a clear analysis that I don't think can be beaten. I'm not trying to compete with anyone here, but okay. So Kissinger now has joined NATO. What is that going to mean? Bring nuclear weapons to the border of Russia?
Well, it means, well, of course, that's the Russian standpoint. They believed from the very beginning that pressing further and further east up against Russia's eastern borders was simply an opportunity for us to eventually place missiles in very close proximity, not just to their country, but to their nuclear deterrent. And they made that clear. That's something that Putin spoke about publicly in 2008. And he tried to warn people in Budapest, look, we're not going to tolerate this. You're not listening. We don't want this. We didn't bother to listen. But I think, you're probably right about Mr. Kissinger. I don't know him personally. I've read a lot of his material. He certainly has the capacity for duplicity, as most diplomats do.
You are such a diplomat. I could see how you rose up the ranks.
I didn't rise that far. Come on.
If you should be the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we wouldn't have had this situation if you were.
But I think you're right. I think he was basically pressured by his fellow club members to join in, and it's unfortunate because he could have played a much more decisive role. I always go back to George Kennan, who, God bless him, until the bitter end, held his line against all of this, and he repeatedly warned against NATO expansion. But George Kennan was someone that had lived for years in Europe, and he understood the Russians. He spoke Russian, spoke German, spoke French. He was an unusual treasure for the United States. We didn't listen enough to him.
We don't have an equivalent in America today or in Europe. Someone of stature, someone of so-called gravitas, who is standing up and saying this has to stop. No one.
Well, no one that we will pay attention to. I think Ambassador Chaz Freeman, he was ambassador to both China and Saudi Arabia, has argued publicly against this. Ambassador Matlock, who was ambassador to Russia under Reagan or the Soviet Union, has made similar statements. But you know the media. Look what's happened to you. I used to flip the dial and listen to Savage. Then all of a sudden, I couldn't flip the dial anymore.
Well, that's because they flipped me off the dial.
Yeah, and I think the same thing has happened to the rest of us that don't take a position that the media likes. And the media is 100% on board for this war with Russia. And they'll all tell you, I've had more than one journalist, oh, Russia's terrible, it's evil. I said, have you ever been there? No. What have you seen? Well, nothing. Well, then why are you taking this position? Well, it's bad. We all know that. And Putin is evil and on and on. Okay, fine. And you find out that they're not going to carry the message that they don't want to reach the American people. That's simple.
Colonel, last time you were on this podcast, you said the Russians were waiting for two things to launch their big and expected winter offensive. One was for the South to freeze over, so that North and South were frozen, so that mechanized equipment could move rapidly over the ground. Has that occurred yet?
Yes.
So when do you estimate the Russian winter offensive will begin? And in your estimation, as a very experienced tank commander, what will this look like? How far? What are they going to do in this offensive? It's a pincer attack, North and South.
Well, first of all, I think it is now sufficiently hardened in the South to support the traffic. And I rather expect that the storm will break sometime between the 21st of January and the 6th or 7th of February.
Why in such a short window?
Well, I think that you have almost no illumination as of 21 January. It's a new moon, so there's practically zero illumination.
Jeez.
Attacking forces usually like to attack when there is no illumination because that favors them and it makes it tougher on the defenders.
A new moon when?
No illumination on 21 January.
No illumination.
Yeah. It's a new moon, so there's nothing out there. And as you move toward 6, 7 February, you get increasing illumination.
Amazing.
But for your breakthrough attack, if you will, your initial assault, you have the cover of darkness. And even though we have thermal imagery sites and we are providing the Ukrainians with detailed assessments and information from our satellite-based intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, nevertheless, it's going to be difficult. And I think we'll know when the offensives are beginning, when two things happen. I think you're going to see jamming of our GPS satellites.
I was going to ask that.
That's going to happen. I think you're going to see electronic warfare used on a grand scale against our satellites. If we press the issue and threaten the Russians, I suppose the Russians could shoot them down if they want to. I think the Russians would rather jam them than shoot them down because, unlike us, the Russians take the position that this war will end and they would like to live with everybody.
Wow.
This is one of the problems I have with us. In 1944, early in 44, when we were bombing the living daylights out of Japan and Germany, Admiral Leahy, who was Franklin Roosevelt's senior military advisor, he'd been the chief of naval operations, and he functioned during the war essentially as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And he brought Marshall and Arnold over to the White House, the chief staff of the Army and the Army Air Corps. And he looked at him and he said, "What in the hell are you doing?" And they looked at him and they said, "What do you mean?" He said, you are destroying everything. There is no reason to destroy everything. Don't you two men understand that when this war ends, we want to live with the Germans and the Japanese? Now, I don't hear anybody talking remotely like that in the West, but that was Admiral Leahy, and he deserves a lot of credit for that because we did a lot of unnecessary damage, and we continued to do so after the war, as we discussed earlier. But that I think is on the minds of the Russians. I think, again, they look at Ukraine and they don't see Ukraine as incurably hostile. After all, it's been part of their world for 1,000 years, and I think they want to live with the Ukrainians when it's over.
Are the Ukrainians and Russians sort of cousins?
Well, of course. I mean, there are differences depending upon who you want to talk to in the gene markers. But I mean, at the end of the day, they have traveled a long road with each other. And they, I don't think Putin wants a permanently hostile Ukraine. Now, as the second part of your question is, what will they do? And they have the capacity for 3 major axes: one that comes up from the south on the east side of the Dnieper River, one that comes from the western end of Ukraine across to the Dnieper River.
From where? On western Ukraine, where would they launch from?
Over just west of Kharkov. West of Kharkov, you look at the map.
Is that why they were fighting so much over Kharkov? Because Russia wanted it as a launching base?
No, I don't think so. Russia actually gave it up because it was too much trouble to hold because it's flat and open. But if you can, but given the force ratios now and the deteriorated Ukrainian position, you can come in from the west, cross the Oxal River, and then you have a free and open highway all the way to Kiev. And you can come up from the south through all of this. You've heard all about Bakhmut and Soledar and all these places that have fallen.
Yeah,
that's another avenue of approach effectively opening up, and through Zaporozhye. So the Russians can come up from the south. They can come in from the east, and you essentially annihilate the Ukrainian military power that's on the east side of the Dnieper. Now, they also have the capacity to attack from Belarusia. Attack south, go straight down, right to the middle of Ukraine, or they could go closer to Kiev, or they could go closer west, closer to, say, Lvov. I don't know. I mean, they have that potential, and I don't know that they will do that immediately. In other words, could the Russians sustain these attacks on 3 axes? Yes, they probably could. Will they? I don't think so. I think the Russians are cautious, and I think they will probably try to clean up everything east of the Dnieper first before they do anything on the western side. But bear in mind, if they do that, by the time they turn west, then you have 300,000 combat troops that are paused to crush what remains west of the Dnieper River.
The city of Bakhmut that you just mentioned, center of fighting in recent weeks, who's in charge? Because Zelensky had the nerve to lie, I think, yesterday or the day before and say they're still fighting there and the Russians haven't taken it. Do you know what the truth is?
Oh, yes, it's in Russian hands. The Ukrainians have lied repeatedly all through this business from the very beginning. I mean, this whole notion of you just give us a few more tanks and guns and we can win. Again, it's back to what we were talking about earlier. What are the fundamentals? And the fundamentals are bad. You don't train people overnight to do lots of complex things. And you introduce several different sets of equipment to different organizations, and it's very difficult to maintain those. And again, you haven't trained on these for very long. Somebody said, well, it doesn't take that long to learn how to operate a tank. And I was on virtually every tank that the U.S. Army ever produced. And I would say, yes, that's probably true. You could train somebody in a few days, but that doesn't teach them how to employ it. It doesn't teach them how to maintain it effectively. It doesn't teach them a whole range of tasks that come with the package. And that's the problem. It's back to the ADA, the air defense business. How much can you reasonably accomplish? And again, that goes back to something else that you brought up, excuse me, which is, are we going to send Western, quote unquote, contractors or Western soldiers to operate some of these things? Because the Ukrainians simply can't pick it up that quickly. I don't know.
Well, I remember in the early days of the Vietnam War, there were rumors that Chinese was sending Chinese pilots to fly the Vietnamese airplanes, the jets, the MiGs. I think they were MiG-17s at the time. I don't remember. But they were Russian pilots, Chinese pilots, I believe. Or were they Russian pilots? I'm not sure.
No, in Korea, they were Russians. But in Vietnam, some of them were Chinese.
Okay. So,
but there were a lot of Chinese on the ground in North Vietnam.
So it's not unlikely that the genius we have in the White House and the merry jesters around him would not send U.S. military to boots on the ground. I mean, they'll escalate. They're doing it step by step to introduce U.S. troops through NATO.
You know, this is the other issue. Our president, and I would argue most of our political leaders, cabinet members, have made a lot of very ill-considered statements. And you continue to hear this nonsense. Until Putin is gone, there can be no peace, you know. Until they agree to evacuate every single inch of so-called Ukrainian soil. And we all know historically that most of what they've got out there in eastern Ukraine was never Ukrainian. Until they get out of Crimea, all this sort of business. When you make these foolish pronouncements, and it becomes increasingly difficult to retreat from them, when it becomes obvious that you can never attain those goals, that's impossible. I mean, where the Russians are right now, they're not giving up. And the people that lived there were overwhelmingly Russians. They're not backing out, and now you're asking them to essentially depose their leader in the Kremlin. It's all nonsense.
Well, wait, I thought he was dying of cancer 6 months ago.
Yeah,
dying of cancer. He was insane. He had Parkinson's disease with arrows in the New York Post showing the shaking hand, holding onto the desk. Every other day, there's another rumor about Putin that I don't believe a word of.
Well, look, just keep something else in mind. We keep talking about them running out of ammunition. Right now, the Russians can fire 60,000 rounds of artillery every day.
What?
60,000 rounds. That includes rockets, missiles, hard shell ammunition every day. The most that the Ukrainians can fire on a daily basis is about 6,000. That's one of the reasons we just removed the 155 millimeter stocks that are in Israel with the goal of sending them to Ukraine. And some of my Israeli friends are uncomfortable with that. But as Netanyahu pointed out, he's correct. That's our property. We can do with it what we want.
You mean now that we've given it to them, they can do what they want with it?
No. That the 155 ammunition on the ground in Israel is American property.
Well, but we sent it to Israel, didn't we?
Yeah, but for our use, potentially.
In Israel?
Yes, in the event that it was a serious emergency and Israel was confronting an existential threat, we stockpiled ammunition there with the goal of rapidly reinforcing. And that's where it comes from. So you've got these huge stocks of ammunition, which we are now removing and sending to Ukraine. So as I said, Netanyahu is right. He said, this is American property. They can take it.
Yeah, but it certainly makes them a little more vulnerable to their own for their own security purposes, doesn't it?
Well, they certainly feel that way. But, nevertheless, this is what's happened. And the reason is what I said. You have 6,000 rounds a day versus 60,000 on the Russian side. And remember that the majority of Russian artillery, and I'm talking about rocket artillery, tactical ballistic missiles, everything, the majority of it hasn't even been employed yet, Doctor.
Right. I think this is a point we should pause at. What we have seen thus far in the Russian offensive has been minimalist. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yes.
So when the winter offensive begins, as you say, in the next few weeks, between a 121 and 206, will it be tanks, artillery, aircraft? What will it be?
Well, the Russians have an expression that we should embrace. They talk about all arms warfare. You're going to see attacks that involve the integration of everything. We talk about combined arms. That's really very limited. That's tanks, infantry, and some artillery. All arms includes everything from electronic warfare to tactical ballistic missiles to infantry fighting vehicles. I think you're going to see something that's very carefully scripted and rehearsed. that will be devastating in its impact because the enemy they are attacking has been weakened fatally. And that's why I'm saying everybody in Washington privately has seen the truth. The truth is Ukraine is scheduled for annihilation. But we're unwilling to negotiate. And we've made it very clear that, the Russians have to accept public humiliation and defeat before we're willing to talk to them. So it's not going to happen.
But all we've done is have Russia rearm, Russia rebuild, Russia retrain, Russia build up a bigger army, and Russia learn how to use all of these integrated forces together. That's what we've achieved thus far.
Yes.
At the same time, we're saying we fear Russia doing to other nations what they've done to Ukraine, which I don't think they intended to do. I don't think they wanted to take Poland and Romania and the Baltic countries. They're just
nobody wants Poland.
Oh, come on. That's not fair.
No, I'm serious, especially the Russians, for God's sakes. That's the last place they want to go.
Why? Because of what happened there last time?
Oh, they've just had, there's a terrible history there. They're not fools. They know that. I mean, you had Putin more than once over the last 10 years make the comment, I'm sure the Western Ukrainians would be a lot happier under Polish administration than under Russian. And he's right. Now, I'm not sure, based upon my experience with Ukrainians growing up with them, that they'll be happy under anybody's administration other than their own. That's another subject. But my point is, no, he doesn't want that. There's no evidence for that. War is a big expense. I don't want to quote The Godfather too much, but it's true. War is a big expense, lots of blood. And the other thing is that we're already seeing this. War always breeds hatred. The longer it lasts, the more people who are harmed, the more people who are killed, the more profound the hatred that takes root. So you don't want these things to drag out. And these are the things that the president of the United States and his peers in Western Europe seem to have completely ignored. Nothing good will come of this. So the sooner it can end on whatever terms everyone can live with, the better. And you always want terms with which your opponent can live with. Of course.
You don't want to break the opponent and humiliate the opponent, as was done to Germany after World War I, which is a basic history lesson. League of Nations, reparations, it bred the hatred. It led to the arrival of Hitler, because the Germans were ready for someone to give them back their dignity. Now, of course, we're not supporting Hitler here. I'm Jewish, number one. But aside from that, I mean, we all know Hitler was not someone to support. But the German people wanted someone to stand up for them after what was done to them after World War I, is my point.
Well, you're right. And the other thing is that the Kaiser in Berlin and the Emperor in Vienna, even the Tsar in Moscow, were all humanitarians compared with the scum and the trash that replaced them.
Jesus.
I mean, see, people don't seem to understand that. I think I read the other day that under Tsar Nicholas I, between 1903 and 1913, he personally signed off on the execution of 10 people.
He did?
Yes.
10 people? 10 people?
10 people in 10 years.
Compared to Stalin, who killed for fun?
Oh, my God. There's no comparison. That's why I say, the Kaiser in Berlin was a decent human being. He wasn't some sort of arch evil character by any stretch of the imagination. Neither was Emperor Franz Josef. But we're treating Putin as though he's something he's not. We're treating Russia as though it's something it's not. The other day I said to somebody, you're smart enough to figure out that Germany is no longer a Nazi state. Why can't you figure out that Russia is no longer a communist state?
Well, because the narrative is, of course, set in stone right now in America amongst the American left, but not just the left. When you've got people on Fox News calling for war every day, like Sean Hannity and such and company, people who themselves have never been in combat, never been in the military, it's shocking, actually, that they get away with this. They're all in on the war. So the offensive, will it be total, meaning they're not going to carpet bomb Kiev, are they?
No, you don't have to do that. But you're going to see the target sets change. Thus far, they have been targeting the energy system, the energy grid, some of the transportation, some command and control, manufacturing facilities, ammunition depots. Once the offensives begin, I think you're going to see major attacks on troop concentrations.
Oh, boy.
And major attacks on headquarters. And then any units that may be out there in the West that could come east to reinforce will be devastated, with strikes as well. That will happen. And the other thing is, first you'll see the satellites jammed, I suspect, and anything else that is used. Remember, we have a whole fleet of aircraft. I don't want to go through them and give names because it's inappropriate, but we have a lot of different aircraft that provide excellent surveillance, listening capabilities, and intelligence on a almost real-time basis.
When you say we, you mean the United States military?
Yes. Oh, yeah. We have fleets of aircraft that do that. That can look 200-300 miles into Ukraine and into Russia. But I think we're going to see monumental jamming. So when the monumental jamming starts and the target sets change along the lines that I've described, that's when the attacks will begin, I think.
Do you believe that the takedown of our airport infrastructure last week was related to Russia?
I really don't know.
Okay.
I just don't know.
Fair enough.
I don't think so.
I thought maybe that was a warning in advance of what they could do to us.
Listen, Doctor, we've known for the last 20 plus years that our electrical grid, our communication systems are all very vulnerable. And we have done almost nothing about it.
Fears of new Russia mobilization, Drudge Report. Massive offensive. Ukraine officials die in crash, making it look as though the Russians shot it down, even though it was probably flying, as you said, in heavy fog, crashed into a phone line or something. Yeah. But you and I have discussed the massive offensive, and the U.S. Sun is saying Vlad's warpath, Putin readying 700,000 troops for massive new offensive in weeks to cut off Ukraine from Europe and face down NATO. You would agree with that, correct?
Yes. I mean, one of the things that he absolutely has to do is cut off the Polish border from Ukraine, because that's where 90+% of the materiel and support comes from Poland.
Poland.
That has to happen. Well, the thing that's disturbing to me is that people keep mentioning, well, doesn't Putin realize that he'll have to face a 20-year insurgency campaign that we will support in Western Ukraine? Well, that's about the dumbest thing I can think of anybody can say, because if a Russian hears that, then the Russian attitude is, well, then we roll right up to the Polish border, right up to Moldova, right up to Romania. We have to control the whole thing because we cannot tolerate that kind of insurgency, intervention, and interference from NATO. Again, it's more stupid talk. I mean, we're plumbing the depths of stupidity these days.
Well, in virtually
no one is thinking through the consequences.
In every arena, it's not just in terms of international relations. We have a group of chickens without heads. They don't know what the hell they're doing in any sphere that I can tell. So if we're looking at a map together, and this little map of Putin's blitzkrieg, General Valery Gerasimov new war chief, will lead the attack, 700,000 men. But let's talk about the tanks for 1 minute if we can. Mm-hmm. They don't fly in. Tanks come in by rail lines, don't they?
Well, that's right. And the tanks that the Russians have, and I'm now told that they're up to 2,000. 6 weeks ago, there were 1,500. Now I'm told they're up to 2,000. Those have already been positioned.
No, I'm sorry. I mean the Ukrainian supply, the supply of new tanks, the Leopards that are supposedly going to Ukraine. They're going to come through Poland, aren't they?
Well, they would have to. I mean, the Leopard tanks, if they finally show up, and as we said at the beginning, Prime Minister Scholz has said he is not sending any unless we send M1 series tanks. So that probably isn't going to happen. The Challengers from Great Britain, they want 14 of those, so they'll have to cross the channel, be loaded onto trains, and then shipped to Poland. We've just decided to send another brigade of armor from Fort Hood, and that equipment is sitting in the Netherlands. That has to be loaded onto trains, and then they'll fly the troops in, presumably to Poland or Lithuania, to link up with the equipment.
No, but going back to the UK Challenger tanks for a minute, if I can, again, looking at this from an amateur point of view, they're going to go to Poland to be delivered to Ukraine. Well, don't the Russians have satellites which can track every train that has tanks on them?
Yes.
And how would they take these trains out with the tanks on them?
Well, the Russians aren't going to attack the rail lines because the rail lines are inside NATO.
Aha.
So they'll wait. They'll wait until the equipment crosses into Ukraine. And then they'll destroy it.
How?
But they're not going to destroy anything on Polish ground,
Ah.
or Lithuanian soil, or German soil, unless they are attacked by Polish, German, or Lithuanian forces.
But once they come over the border from Poland, the tanks, all 14 of them, all 14 of the British tanks, and I hope they do come with other than Lucas wiring.
Yeah.
That's,
oh God.
That's because I've owned Jaguars. I owned classic Jaguars for a long while.
Oh yeah. What a wonderful car with the wiring.
Beautiful to look at. But nevertheless, they used to say you needed one Jaguar to drive and one for parts. They weren't too far from the truth. But let's say these Leopards do arrive. I'm sorry, the Challengers arrive and they're delivered over the border. Don't the Russians track them every step of the way? And once they're over the border, can they take them out?
Yes. Once they go into Ukraine, it's fair game.
And how do they take them out?
Well, they have a whole variety of things. If these things are immobilized in some fashion, they can't go forward because they can't move over bridges, then that works. I mean, there are a lot of different things they can do.
You mean if the Russians took out the bridges?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And these are very, very heavy tanks. One of the criticisms of our Western tanks has been for a long time that they're all over 50 tons. And that means that most of the bridges they'd have to cross in Eastern Europe and frankly, in much of the rest of the world won't take that kind of weight.
Well, think of the infrastructure money we could be sending over there to build bridges.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't expect the Challengers to make much difference. It's not a new system. It's an old system. It's been updated, but it has its problems and its drawbacks. Maybe if they can get them far enough forward, they can use them as stationary guns against advancing Russian troops. I don't know, but I don't have much confidence in it. 14
Challenger tanks from the UK in total?
Yep.
Why is the UK so militantly anti-Russian right now?
That's an excellent question, and I found it difficult to understand. And I talked to a number of people over there, and they are just livid with rage. And I'm not sure why. I haven't figured it out, but they're more woke than woke. And in fact, I was reading something earlier today about the Prime Minister of Finland, this lady.
Yeah.
Who says that we all need to be prepared to fight for 15 years if necessary.
Is she
to
ready?
Drive the Russians out of Ukraine?
Is she ready to do it? I doubt it.
Well, I think she's having her nails done at this point. Yes,
isn't she coming back from a party somewhere with her girlfriend? So the UK is suddenly anti-Russian to a foaming mouth level. No one knows why, other than they've been moved so far to the left that they've outmaneuvered the former communist states in terms of their ideology in many ways, called wokeness, but we all know what that is. So January 21st, today is the 18th. Oh, boy, we're close. We're close. Everyone seems to be saying the same thing. It's going to happen very soon.
Well, I mean, again, this is all in the hands of Gerasimov, the Russian chief of the general staff, who's now the overall commander.
Valery Gerasimov, is he known as a right-wing, a hawk, let's say? He must be.
No. He is known, if anything, as a very professional soldier.
Huh?
He doesn't manifest much emotion in public. He seems to be, if anything, very level-headed, very matter-of-fact, businesslike. He's learning, though, let's face it, everybody is, because when's the last time anybody committed large forces like this on the ground in Europe?
I haven't seen it in my lifetime. I'm only 80 years old.
1945.
I'm only 80 years old.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Gerasimov had his hand in the first operation, and I think they learned a lot from what they did to begin with. I think you're going to see the formations they use will be different from what we saw in February. I think almost everything will be brigade size, varying, from 4,000 to 6,000. You'll have a few divisions.
Is that to limit the target size?
I think so, partially. It also is based on their experience that smaller is more maneuverable and faster.
Well, what happened in the beginning of this invasion of Ukraine by Russia?
Well, they use these things they call battalion tactical groups.
But we saw a 40-mile line of tanks and trucks and armored personnel carriers. You remember that phase of the war? Yep. And I gasped. I said, 40 miles worth of men and weapons? What the hell was that about?
Again, I think that the assumptions about what they would face and how rapidly we would agree to negotiate led them down the primrose path. And they discovered, look, nobody's going to talk to us. They're not going to negotiate with us. They all want to kill us. I mean, the thing that Putin now says over and over and over again to his country, he said, we're not simply at war with this force in Ukraine. We're at war with the collective West. And he's right. Even though I don't think the vast majority of Europeans or Americans want anything to do with a war against Russia.
I've never seen a war like this emerging and billowing and growing without a public debate on it in this nation. There's no anti-war movement in this country. For the first time in my lifetime, I see no anti-war movement. All of the so-called regular players of anti-war activity have gone silent. They're all in on this war against Russia. It's actually quite shocking to see this. And I keep, when I'm online, Colonel, and I get attacked for being a Russian agent or this and that, which they've stopped doing because that line is no longer working. That was probably invented by one of Zelensky's friends from the theater troupe in order to silence the opposition. My answer to them is peace is patriotic. It's an old it's an old saying, but it actually neutralizes a lot of the criticism because it's true. Peace is the ultimate patriotic thing at a certain point. We're not being attacked. I'm not speaking from the point of view of America being invaded and I'm laying down for the enemy. I'm talking about a war that has nothing whatever to do with us. Nothing. That's my point of view. What the hell does this have to do with U.S. security? Nothing.
No, and again, this is we have a manufactured enemy with the Putin label on it that has no interest in fighting with us, doesn't present any threat to us. I would argue that right now the principal threat to the United States emanates from Central America.
Yes.
It comes in the form of illicit drugs and illegal human trafficking.
Yes.
And those things are tearing us apart, destroying our national cohesion. And you have a government that is not only indulging it, but seems to encourage it.
Yes, waving them over the border.
And in the meantime, I don't know very many people who really believe that our economy is in great shape.
Well, we're in bad shape here on virtually every level I can think of. And the blitzkrieg that we're all expecting, if you want to call it that, or the lightning war, I don't think it's going to be a lightning war. Do you? No,
I think it'll be very deliberate. And it will be crushing.
They will roll them over. That's the Russian method, is roll over the enemy, slowly but surely.
Well, it'll be crushing and it will be thorough. And it's tragic and it's unnecessary and it should never have happened. That's the lesson.
It could have been stopped. They could have been stopped.
Oh, very early.
So at the end of the day, there has to be a settlement. There must be, for the sake of the world, for the sake of the Ukrainian people, for the sake of Russia, for the sake of world stability. And the dividing line will no doubt be the Dnieper River, correct?
I think so, but again, we just don't know. This thing could end up stopping at the Polish border. I mean, if you are President Putin, and all of your advisors and military commanders are telling you, if we don't complete this task, we run the risk of more trouble down the line. The United States will infiltrate into Western Ukraine and stir up an insurgency, and these diehards that are in Western Ukraine will come after us. So the only solution is to go the whole way. Again, this is the danger of these ill-considered public statements. No one has talked under any circumstances, as you point out, about the criticality of peace.
It's not even in the quotient. I don't see it anywhere. It's never even mentioned. It's not even a headline. Should there be peace? Should there be peace talks? What will it take to make this stop? How do we settle this dispute? Is there any middle ground that can be met between Ukraine and Russia? I don't see one word along those lines virtually anywhere. The only one I saw, as I said at the beginning of this podcast, was 4 months ago when Kissinger spoke wisely. And of course, he has now capitulated to the the group that is running the world at Davos. I don't have much hope for any of this myself.
Well, I think we probably should give President Trump some credit for having urged an end to the fighting and peace talks.
Yeah, but
now, I haven't heard much from him
but
since then.
You don't hear much about what Trump says that's good. All we hear is Trump's bad. But, you bring up Trump for a minute. Were you an advisor to Trump when he was in power at all?
Not really. I mean, I was on the outside until he brought me in to advise the Secretary of Defense, which in truth, he had me there to advise him and to support him over the last 60 days, 90 days that he was in office.
Who was the Secretary of Defense at that time?
The acting Secretary of Defense at the time was Chris Miller.
See, these are silent individuals that we've never heard of, and yet Milley is everywhere. You see him as almost like General Eisenhower now. That's a sarcastic.
Well, Milley was really in charge. That's the problem, and he's remained in charge. I would tell you that he is making all the decisions over in the Department of Defense that he can make.
But what about the great defense secretary?
I can't evaluate the man. I don't know him, but I just don't see much evidence that he's influencing anything. I think everything starts and ends with Milley.
Isn't Milley?
And, you mentioned his trip. I think that one of the reasons he went there was this man Zaluzhny was trying to make it clear to him that if the Ukrainian forces are to survive, they have to break contact and withdraw in front of the Russians. And you have Zelensky that says that's impossible. We have to maintain the fiction that we can win. And if you break contact with the Russians and withdraw, that'll signal weakness. And then we're through. People won't support us. I think that's really what the debate is all about.
Wait, I want to follow that before you go, Colonel. Zelensky has to maintain the fiction of what?
The fiction that they can still win.
But what does it have to do with it? What does it have to do with Milley going there?
Well, Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of Ukrainian forces, has allegedly had enormous difficulty dealing with Zelensky. Zelensky has insisted on these counterattacks over and over and over again when Zaluzhny has reportedly counseled against it.
I'm hearing that the comedian is now doing what Hitler did, overriding his own generals?
Yes, I think he's very Hitlerian.
Well, I don't know why you would say that. He's only closed down all opposition media, closed down churches that don't agree with him. I wouldn't say he's a bad fellow. After all, he's running the only democracy in the area.
Yeah. I forgot.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Please, you went off the script, Colonel. Well,
anyway, the point is that I think he was looking for someone with whom he could commiserate. And so I think Milley went there to commiserate with Zaluzhny and Zaluzhny wanted to give Milley a true picture.
Oh.
Well, that's fine, but I don't think it makes any difference because there's no evidence that either Zelensky or his sponsors in Washington have any intention of changing course.
Yeah, but we don't have to worry because another new story just came out. Mad Vlad Putin's cancer worsening, and he could lash out with nuke threats, claims insider. So he's going to die of cancer before this war gets worse, Colonel. I don't think we should worry too much.
Well, the only thing we should say in connection with that, and I have no inside knowledge whatsoever about Mr. Putin's health, but if Mr. Putin were to die and be replaced, I would tell everyone that whoever takes over is liable to be infinitely less friendly to us than Putin. Putin was always willing to do business with the West. Putin understood the West. Remember, the man's fluent in German. Every time he talked to Angela Merkel or he talked to Schultz, he spoke in German. He knows something about us, and he wants peace with us or has wanted it in the past. And he's made that clear. Whoever succeeds him is very unlikely to be remotely like that. I would expect someone far more nationalist and more martial and militant.